The forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada is a shameful and disturbing part of Canada's history that few Canadians are aware of. For many Indigenous women, their ability to have children was taken away from them without their knowledge or consent. The practice of forced sterilization began in the 1930s and continued until the 1970s, with thousands of Indigenous women being affected. In this video, we will explore the history of forced sterilization in Canada, the impact it had on Indigenous communities, and the ongoing fight for justice and reconciliation. The history of forced sterilization in Canada is rooted in eugenic beliefs that were popular in the 20th century. Eugenics is the study of improving the genetic composition of a population by controlling the reproduction of individuals. In Canada, eugenicists believed that Indigenous people were inferior and that their genes were responsible for social and economic problems. They saw forced sterilization as a way to prevent the transmission of unwanted traits to future generations. In the 1930s, a government-led campaign began to sterilize Indigenous women without their knowledge or consent. The vast majority of these women were Indigenous and lived on reserves. Many were deemed mentally defective or feeble-minded, categories that were often based on arbitrary and discriminatory criteria. There were no standardized procedures for determining who would be sterilized, and many women were simply targeted because they were Indigenous. Forced sterilization remained legal in Canada until well into the 1970s, when attitudes towards eugenics began to shift. However, even after the practice was technically outlawed, it continued to occur in some hospitals and clinics. It is estimated that between 1930 and 1970, up to 25,000 Indigenous women were forcibly sterilized in Canada. The impact of forced sterilization on Indigenous communities has been devastating. For many women, the procedure was performed without their knowledge or consent, leaving them feeling violated and traumatized. For others, the removal of their reproductive organs meant that they could never have children, a loss that has had profound effects on their lives and the lives of their families. The practice of forced sterilization has also contributed to the erosion of trust between Indigenous communities and the Canadian government. Many Indigenous people feel that their bodies and their reproductive rights were violated by the Canadian state, and that the government has not done enough to address this historical injustice. In recent years, there has been growing awareness of the forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada, and a movement has emerged to seek justice and reconciliation. In 2018, a class-action lawsuit was filed on behalf of survivors, seeking compensation and an apology from the Canadian government. The case is ongoing, and it remains to be seen what the outcome will be. The forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada is a horrific chapter in Canadian history that must be acknowledged and reckoned with. Indigenous women deserve recognition of the harm that was done to them, and a commitment from the Canadian government to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. The ongoing fight for justice and reconciliation must include not only compensation for survivors, but also a larger conversation about the systemic discrimination and racism that has been directed towards Indigenous people in Canada for centuries. In conclusion, the forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada is a dark chapter in Canadian history that has had profound and lasting effects on Indigenous communities. The practice was rooted in eugenic beliefs about Indigenous people, and thousands of women were forcibly sterilized between the 1930s and the 1970s. The impact on these women and their families has been devastating, and the practice has contributed to the erosion of trust between Indigenous communities and the Canadian government. The ongoing fight for justice and reconciliation must include recognition of this historical injustice, compensation for survivors, and a commitment to preventing such atrocities from ever happening again.